Hello again, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather on the 25th day of September 2022. Up first, let's see what comes up. Hazardous weather graphic. There's a flood watch out for the northern panhandle there in the shaded areas of the northern southeast coastal areas, as well as areas of the inside waters. And that's out through Wednesday night due to additional rainfall that could result in flooding in some areas, possibly. Taking a more detailed look at that coastal flood watch, again, out until 4 p.m. Wednesday, sorry, not through Wednesday night, but until 4 p.m. Wednesday afternoon. And for the areas of Skagway, Haines, Gustavus, Sitka, Hoona, and Juneau. And river rises throughout the hatched area there, and moderate flooding potential due to the heavy rain, which could result in isolated landslides and steep terrain. This, again, just a watch, not a warning, so it's a possibility that there will be some flooding occurring. And also some key points here of the rainfall location and timing. Heavy rain moving in Sunday night, which appears to be on track right now with the heavier rain occurring over the southern into the central panhandle today. But the heaviest rain Monday into Monday night, and then light to moderate rainfall through Wednesday. And from there, taking a look at the Copper River Basin, light snow expected here Monday morning through Wednesday morning. Some of the amounts, Eureka could pick up 1 to 2 inches, Slana, though, less than an inch expected, and then Paxson might pick up 1 to 2 inches there. But snowfall that falls overnight will probably melt in the daytime, with lows overnight expected in the maybe upper 20s to mid 30s, but daytime highs well into the 40s. So that should melt it off, whatever falls, except for the higher elevations, of course. And from there, looking at satellite imagery, you can see a long fetch of moisture from off the bottom of the picture there, streaming northward and then northeastward in across the North Gulf Coast today. That mostly that's mostly cloudiness, mid and high level clouds from Prince William Sound over to Yakutat and the northern panhandle. Rainfall amounts not all that heavy. Heaviest down over the southern part of the panhandle, right near that warm front as it pushed through. For example, Ketchikan picked up over an inch in the last 12 hours today. But back to the west, clearing, some sunshine. In fact, a lot of sunshine over Cook Inlet and portions of the Kenai Peninsula. Kodiak Island seeing some clearing. Next, then up into Sitna Valley and Copper River Basin, and some clearing over much of the interior today with some gusty winds, but nothing too strong. And then rain over St. Lawrence Island with north winds gusting to about 30 miles an hour there. Then out to the west, you can see the next system pushing into the western Aleutians, bringing another round of gusty winds to 40, maybe 50 miles an hour with moderate rain at times there. Starting to push into the Adak area this afternoon. A little fast on that chart, may not get in there till this evening. And then that weakening low pressure and trough along the west coast, southwest interior from the Bering Strait down into Bristol Bay. That brought some areas of light shower activity to that location, anywhere from a few hundredths of an inch to maybe 1 to 2/10 of an inch at most across that entire area. In fact, some areas didn't see anything at all over the last 12 hours. Next, ended down into the Alaska Peninsula, where Cold Bay picked up about, let's see, 2/10 of an inch of precipitation today. In the Panhandle, again, over an inch falling at Ketchikan. Cake picked up half an inch, but only 3/100 of an inch at Juneau. And then before the rain ended about midday today at Valdez, they had about 1/3 of an inch of precipitation. Otherwise, clearing out over the Copper River Basin with south winds gusting to 30 miles an hour at, let's see, Gulkana and Anchorage. Palmer seeing southeast winds gusting to about the same, 30 miles an hour today, with temperatures in the upper 50s in Palmer, mid-50s in the Anchorage area. And about the warmest location was over the southern Panhandle and south central Alaska. I didn't see any 60s. Ketchikan had 57. Actually, warm spot was Klawock with 59 degrees. Otherwise, not too bad over the interior today, eastern northern interior. And for tonight, that low tracks northward, deepens. Look for gale force winds with gusts of 50 miles an hour occurring along the north coast and eastern North Gulf Coast areas. Gale warnings in the forecast for tonight with heavy rain pushing northward along that warm front. And then the lighter rain will be down to the south, but it'll be wet across all the Panhandle tonight. But look for some good solid rain to move in to the entire area there. That scatters out to a few showers along the southern coast of the Kenai Peninsula, maybe into the Barren Islands, but should stay dry over Kodiak Island and south central Alaska. In fact, much of the interior looks pretty dry tonight. Any shower activity will be pretty isolated or widely scattered, mostly over mountainous terrain. Look for some low clouds and fog for the Arctic coast, north slope areas resulting in IFR conditions. And that low weakens over along the southwest coast there. A couple of troughs will keep some showers going over St. Lawrence Island, scattered showers down to the Alaska Peninsula. Should dry out over Bristol Bay. And that weakening front will spread some 30-knot winds into the central Aleutians with rain. Pretty nice conditions there for the Pribilofs. Clear skies St. Paul this afternoon, probably lasting into this evening. Could see some low clouds and fog with that light wind condition. Same thing for the Fox Islands. And for Monday, that low tracks into the interior there, northward, across the eastern North Gulf Coast. May pass right over Yakutat early in the day. Rainfall will continue on the moderate to heavy side for the northern Panhandle, with rain extending all the way down to Dixon Entrance, but a little lighter down that way. Again, some shower activity possible, diminishing as you head west there. Could be another partly sunny day for Cook Inlet, the Kenai Peninsula, Madanuska, and at least the eastern Madanuska Valley, more likely the Susitna Valley, picking up some possible shower activity in the form of rain or snow along the Alaska Range. Eastern interior areas, but that's going to be light. Look for some scattered snow showers for the Brooks Range to the eastern Arctic coast, and rain and a little bit of an increase in the winds push into the Fox Islands tomorrow afternoon, and that low continuing to weaken up to about 1,000 millibars, and that's holding together enough to keep it mostly cloudy and unsettled with some light shower activity across the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and Nunivak Island. Kind of a solid area of low clouds, drizzle, fog, and some light rain for St. Lawrence Island up to the Bering Strait, and then some pretty gusty north winds on the backside of that low over the western Aleutians. Could see gusts 60 miles an hour over the Shemya-Attu area. But that gets replaced by high pressure on Tuesday with light winds, dry conditions. The low shifts eastward, right almost over Unalaska Island in the afternoon, with rain across the entire area. Moderate rain, gusty winds for the moving into southwest Kodiak Island, the Aleutian Range, Bristol Bay, east-northeast winds, and some rain for the Pribilofs down to Atka, but drying out over the western Aleutians. Not too bad over interior Alaska, maybe some light snow showers or snow from the eastern Brooks Range up to the eastern Arctic coast, maybe as far south as just north of Eagle. And rain continues for the northern Panhandle. It'll be heaviest in the north, lighter in the south. Otherwise, not too bad. Looking at lows tonight, upper 50s there under mild southerly flow on the east side of that frontal boundary over the southern Panhandle to near 50 in the north. Mid-30s Copper River Basin, Susitna Valley, Kuskokwim Valley, upper 30s Bristol Bay, upper 30s to lower 40s, Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, Kodiak, highs tomorrow, 40s to lower 50s, mid-40s for the Copper River Basin, and may hit upper 60s there across Prince of Wales Island, maybe. I think you'd need some sunshine for that. That may be a little high though. Upper 40s for Bristol Bay, followed by lows upper 40s to lower 50s for the Panhandle. Mid-30s Copper River Basin, Kuskokwim Valley, upper 30s to lower 40s South Central Alaska. Highs 45 to 50 now in the Copper River Basin, Susitna Valley. Lower 50s Cook Inlet and the Kenai Peninsula area. Mid-50s Kodiak Island. And mostly in the 50s for the southeast coast. Up to the north, lows tonight in the 20s to mid-30s. Highs tomorrow, south of the Brooks Range in the 40s, north of the mountains there in the 30s. Followed by lows again, mostly in the 20s, Brooks Range out to the Arctic coast, and mostly in the lower to mid-30s, south of the mountains. Highs 40s south of the Brooks Range, lower 30s, lower to mid-30s from the Brooks Range to the Arctic coast, out to the southwest, lows in the 30s except the Aleutians in the 40s. And highs tomorrow in the 40s, 50s for the Aleutians, followed by lows in the 30s once again, but 40s for the Aleutians, and highs upper 40s to lower 50s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather. Up north, IFR, Brooks Range, across eastern North Slope to the Arctic coast. A little bit better conditions back to the west, around Wainwright or so, on down to near Cape Lisburne. VFR there. Eastern interior, down in the Susitna Valley, northern Cook Inlet, Connect, Turnagain Arms, VFR. With lower conditions east and west, IFR along the southwest coast into the southern Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island, Nunivak Island, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, IFR, Fogneck Island, VFR. IFR there from Eagle southward across the eastern Copper River Basin to the eastern North Gulf Coast, Cape St. Elias all the way down across the Panhandle. Big area of IFR there, southwest Bering Sea, and from about Nikolsky westward to Shimmy and Attu. VFR for the Pribilofs and Alaska Peninsula. And for the afternoon, narrowing VFR, but it holds over St. Paul, St. George Island and the central Alaska Peninsula. Otherwise, IFR spreading eastward to about False Pass on the Alaska Peninsula there. Southern Alaska, areas of marginal VFR with some areas of VFR, especially Cook Inlet and the western Kenai Peninsula to the western Alaska Range. Norton Sound, about Nome, Golovin, White Mountain, southward into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. IFR looks like over the Tanana Valley to the border. Arctic Coast IFR, IFR, Copper River Basin, across Yakutat, and solid IFR for the southeast coast. And for the morning Tuesday, areas of IFR over interior Alaska with not much in the way of any VFR until you get down to Kodiak Island, the Aleutian Range there. IFR pushing up to the Pribilofs, Adak, Atka, along the eastern Aleutians and across the western Alaska Peninsula. IFR holding there over the northern Panhandle, but a little improvement to the central and southern areas. North Gulf Coast mostly marginal, northern Prince William Sound IFR. That extends now across Manuska, Susitna Valley, northern Cook Inlet into the Kuskokwim Valley. And for the afternoon, IFR Bristol Bay to Kodiak Island, southeast Bering Sea, eastern Aleutians, also St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait, up and over to the central and eastern Arctic coast. Some pretty good VFR for the interior of the state. As you can see, just some marginal VFR along the central Alaska Range covering south central Alaska. And improving over the northern Panhandle, Yakutat, VFR, marginal VFR becomes IFR over the southern southeast coast. Anatuvik, marginal, but optimistically Adigan, VFR at most times, could be marginal at other times. Lake Clark and Merrill going for a VFR day for both of those passes. Rainy VFR. Windy, marginal VFR, possible IFR in the northern entrance. Same pattern for Isabel. Lowest conditions on the north side and marginal through the pass. A little better to the south. Mentasta, go with IFR at times throughout the day, north and south. And for Tanita, marginal VFR, better conditions on the western approach, lower on the east side. Portage, marginal VFR. And Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, kind of a gradient across the eastern part of the state and Panhandle, and also over the southwest Bering Sea and Aleutians, running 2 to 12,000 feet out west and 2 to about 12,000 feet across the eastern interior and Panhandle. Icing, with the south to north flow there, we've got some considerable moderate icing with that slow-moving frontal boundary into the northern Panhandle and eastern North Gulf Coast, lighter amounts off to the northwest into the Tanana Valley. And then another potential for some isolated moderate rime icing moving eastward there into the eastern Aleutians, covering the southwest Bering Sea areas. And looking at the jet stream, good south to north flow, and the frontal boundary line parallel to that wind flow, so it's slow moving and could drop a fair amount of precipitation eastern North Gulf Coast and in the northern Panhandle. But up to 150 knots there right across the southeast interior, west-northwest 70 knots from the northern Bering Sea down across Bristol Bay, 90-knot westerlies just south of the Aleutians, 9,000 feet southerlies, 60 to 65 knots there right across the northern Panhandle, and at 3,000 feet, 40 to 50-knot winds coming into the southeast coast. Pretty light over southern Alaska, Kodiak Island. Gets a little brisker up along the north slope there, eastern Arctic coast, maybe 30 knots or so, 25 to 30. And then 60-knot northeasterlies coming into the western Aleutians. Turbulence, occasional moderate, considerable moderate chop Aleutians, and all of the Panhandle to Yakutat, maybe Cape St. Elias.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and joining us once again is Eric Stevens, our good friend from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, based up at UAF. And thanks for joining us, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Oh, happy to be here, Dave.
And we love to hear about all the fascinating developments, new and old, and how we're using the tools here, especially around Alaska. And I've got to think that, satellite meteorology right now is a fascinating time to be involved in. If we go back to the first satellite, Tyros, back in 1960, I think is when we got some of those first pictures. Weather and meteorology probably changed that day for a whole lot of people, and it's still changing today, right?
Oh, you know it. Satellite imagery is so important, and it's getting better all the time. Yeah. Of course, never perfect, but especially for us in Alaska, where there are other data sets like radars and weather balloons are so thinly spread. Right. The satellite is the great equalizer because the satellite sees everything.
Right.
Yeah. Right. We've got one particular issue in volcanic ash detection.
That's a big deal here. Yeah.
You know it. If you fly an airplane into volcanic ash, your jet engine might just fail. And an airplane without engines is in a world of hurt.
Sure.
So if there's a volcano that goes off, satellite imagery is the way to track that plume of ash and to tell pilots this is where you need to not be to avoid this ash plume. And there's a phrase out there, what's the difference? What's the difference?
Okay.
Well, it turns out, what we're going to discuss today, that the difference is everything. There's a technique called channel differencing.
Okay.
That if you take one piece of the spectrum of what the satellite detects and a slightly different wavelength of that spectrum, even though those two images might look similar, magical things happen when you subtract one from the other. And they reveal information that was already there, but it was hard to find until you did that subtraction.
That sounds like Nicolas Cage in National Treasure when he's got those fancy glasses and he's flipping one up and back and forth. I mean, is this what we're talking about?
Well, let's go more highbrow and talk Michelangelo.
Oh,
so apparently Michelangelo made some amazing sculpture, and someone said, Michael, that's amazing. How did you do it? And Michelangelo's reply allegedly was, well, in that rock, the statue was already in there.
Right.
I just scraped away the unnecessary bits. In satellite meteorology, sometimes there are meteorological features that are in the data, but you can't see it until you combine or difference some of the channels.
Okay.
And we've got a case, good old Pavlov volcano goes off now and then.
Sure.
And you can observe directly a picture of the volcano. Just take it with your iPhone. You can see a volcano going off.
Yep.
Right. But if you want to get the broad view, we need satellite to do that. Now, there are a couple of wavelengths that we can look at. So what's a wavelength? That's the amount of space between a peak and a valley and another peak in a certain part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We're going to look at 12 micron wavelength and 10.8 micron wavelength.
What is a micron?
So what's a micron? Yeah, we're getting into the geek department now. A micron is a unit of length, and it is quite tiny. We're looking at what's called long wave wavelengths.
Okay.
But it takes 25,000 of these microns to make an inch. A human blood cell is about 5 microns across. So when we're talking about 12 micron imagery as allegedly long wave, well, that's relative.
Pretty short for light.
Yeah, it's other part of the, it's just an expression for the spectrum there.
Okay.
So we can look at a 12 micron image, say a satellite image. At 12 microns, we're seeing a heat signature here, really, and the way this color enhancement works is the yellow and the red stuff is high cold clouds down here over the Gulf of Alaska into South Central. And if you were asked, where do you find the volcanic ash plume in this image?
Hey, where do you find the volcanic plume in this image?
It's hard to do. I'm not sure I could find it. If you were to look at this image and just say, show me what jumps out at you here, I'd say, well, nothing really. Well, let's look. So 12 micron doesn't help us. Let's look at 10.8 microns.
All right.
All right, look at that. It's practically the same image. So where's this volcanic ash? Can't find it at 12 microns, can't really see it at 10.8, but when we subtract one channel from the other, magically the plume appears. The color enhancement here highlights the ash in blue.
Wow.
The information was already there, but we couldn't find it until we subtracted one channel from another.
Very interesting.
It's almost magical. Similarly, let's say you're looking for fog up on the North Slope. It's kind of a foggy neighborhood.
Sure.
In 11 micron and 3.9 micron, we've got a 3.9 micron image here. It's a big fuzzy blur over Barrow. We can't see where the fog is. But the information is lurking in there waiting for us to reveal it. All we have to do is find that difference between the 11 micron and the 3.9, and then this image becomes this image, and the fog bank jumps right out, and you can see it up there at Barrow. Now, you got to choose the right tool for the job.
Sure.
Like they say, you open your toolbox, all kinds of stuff in there. What do we need for this particular task? If you want to find volcanic ash, we look at 12 and 10.8 micron, find that difference. If you want to find fog, we'll look at 11 and 3.9 micron, find that difference. It's great, different tools for different jobs. Of course, there's always caveats and gotchas, but this fog procedure, it only works at night, because when the sun comes up, it gets in the way. So every product has its strengths and limitations, and in meteorology, the challenge is using the right tool for the right job, and these are some of those tools.
And discovery is still happening, even with meteorology. The weather's been around for a long time, but the tools that are being developed to understand the meteorology is a fascinating and still very new science.
It's such a young science. We've come so far. I'm getting old enough now that I can literally say that, when I was a boy, we didn't have this kind of thing. And there's new things happening all the time. New satellites will be launched in coming years that will have better instruments than ever before. It's an exciting time, and this is so helpful for Alaska because satellites help fill in the gaps between other ways of observing the weather. Satellites, the great equalizer for Alaska.
Yeah, and help so many people stay safe in so many ways every day up here in the last frontier.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, protecting lives and property.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Eric. We love to hear about this fascinating information, and boy, it just makes me want to go watch satellite pictures all day. So hopefully we're inspiring more people to do the same thing, and just be curious. It's a wonderful thing. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and we'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Looking at today's sea ice analysis, you can see there is no sea ice along the coast there. No ice from Wrangel Island into Mackenzie Bay. And that's not going to change much over the next week or so. So moving on to the coastal water forecast. For the south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow, gale warnings, south winds 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings on the north coast, southeast winds 40 knots. And for Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, and Stevens Passage, gale warnings out there for east to south winds at 40 knots and southeast winds 25 knots for Clarence Strait. Outlook for Tuesday, lighter winds over the inside channels and along the coast as well. For Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, south at 10, Stevens Passage, south winds 15 knots. Same thing for Clarence Strait, south winds 15 knots. For the south coast, small craft advisories, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots with 12-foot seas. And then west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots with seas just under 10 feet in the north coast. Prince William Sound tomorrow, west winds 15 knots. Small craft advisories for the North Gulf Coast, west winds 25 to 30 knots, and west winds 20 knots for the Barren Islands. Northwest winds 15 for Kamishak Bay. Cook Inlet, west winds 15 knots, seas 4 feet. And for Tuesday, Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, east winds 25 to 30 knots. Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, as well as the western North Gulf Coast, looking at good gales out of the southeast at 40 knots. And small craft advisories for the eastern North Gulf Coast, south winds 30 knots. Small craft advisories for Bristol Bay, east winds at 25 knots with 5-foot seas. Kodiak Island, southwest winds 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, west winds 15 knots, 5-foot seas. Bristol Bay, southwest winds 15 knots, seas around 5 feet. And then gale warnings for east winds at 35 knots for Bristol Bay with seas building to 10 feet on Tuesday. Small craft advisories, the Alaska Peninsula, south to southeast winds 30 knots. Gale warnings for Kodiak Island for south to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots, seas up to 14 feet. Small craft advisories for the Fox Islands on Monday, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And on average, a south wind at 30 knots for Adak and Atka. Gale warnings for the area from Kiska to Shemya, north winds 40 knots, seas near 20 feet. And then those turn west to 25 knots for the day Tuesday from Shemya to Kiska. Central Aleutians, gale warnings, northwest winds 35 knots. Gale warnings also for the Fox Islands, west-northwest winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the southwest coast, Kuskokwim Delta coast, west winds 15 knots. Yukon Delta coast, north at 15. Northeast winds 15 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Light variable winds 10 to 15 knots for St. Matthew Island, St. Paul, and St. George. Outlook for Tuesday. For the Pribilofs, north winds 30 knots, east winds 30 knots for the southwest coast there south of Nunivak Island. Yukon Delta coast, northeast at 25, northeast at 20 for St. Lawrence Island. North winds 20 knots for St. Matthew Island. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest toward Barter Island demarcation point. Lighter winds out of the east on the central coast, picking back up to small craft advisory levels for the western Arctic coast down to Cape Thompson, 25 knots from the east and northeast, Cape Thompson to Wales, northeast at 15. Then for Tuesday, small craft advisories, Cape Thompson to Cape Beaufort, northeast winds 25 knots. For the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, and east-northeast at 20 knots for the central and western Arctic coast. And for tonight, pretty dry over the interior with some clearing. Look for low clouds and fog, north slope Arctic coast, especially on the central and east coast. But heavy rain and gale force winds moving onto the north coast and into the northern panhandle about Yakutat eastward, with a flood watch out through 4 p.m. Wednesday for the northern panhandle for possible flooding. Otherwise, the next system pushing across the Aleutians bring wind and rain into the central Aleutians, and that progresses eastward to the eastern Aleutians, almost to the Pribilofs, probably by early evening, reaching St. Paul, St. George. Rain moderate to heavy at times over the northern panhandle, and showers over the interior, with mostly dry conditions for the Arctic coast. And then the outlook for Tuesday, partly to mostly sunny in the interior, with just isolated showers now over the Copper River Basin. Rain starts to let up some, but keeps wet over the panhandle, and some light snow in the northeast interior. Rain and wind move into Bristol Bay and Kodiak Island in the afternoon, with gusty north winds across the east central Aleutian.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.